Hello, call me Redhead, and alright, let's get started. Number 10. The 2-inch shoe law. Medieval England had many problems. Disease, famine, war, plague, people dumping waste into the street. But apparently, one of the biggest emergencies was men wearing shoes that were too pointy. In 1463, England passed a law saying that if you were not a lord or someone above that rank, the points of your shoes could not be longer than 2 inches. 2 inches. That was the official government limit for how dramatic your toes were allowed to be. And this was not because the shoes were practical, they were the opposite of practical. These shoes were called poulaines, krakows, or pikes, and some of them were so long that the tips stretched a foot or more past the actual foot. Imagine trying to run from a robber while your shoes arrive at the crime scene 3 seconds before you do. The rich love them because useless fashion has always been the favorite sport of the wealthy. Some men stuffed the tips with moss or wool so the points would hold their shape. Some even tied the tips back to their knees so they could walk without face-planting into a pile of medieval horse poop. But here is the funniest part. The law did not say, nobody should wear these ridiculous shoes. It said, only important people should wear these ridiculous shoes. So, if you were poor, your feet had to stay humble. You could be rich from trade, own property, have more money than a small village, and still be told, sorry, your bloodline is not fancy enough to trip over yourself with dignity. Number 9. The assize of bread and ale. This one actually starts like a good idea. Medieval people ate bread constantly. Bread was not a snack. Bread was breakfast, lunch, dinner, plate, napkin, emotional support, and sometimes your only reason to wake up. So the government said, we need to protect people from dishonest bakers and brewers. Fair enough. Then they created the assize of bread and ale, a medieval law that controlled the price, weight, and quality of bread and beer. Still sounds reasonable until it becomes unreasonable. Instead of letting the price of bread rise and fall normally, the price stayed fixed. So if wheat was cheap, you got a big loaf. If wheat was expensive, you still paid the same price, but the loaf got smaller. And because bakers could be punished for selling underweight bread, many of them started adding extra bread just to be safe. That is one possible origin of the baker's dozen, where you get 13 instead of 12. Not because bakers were generous, because medieval punishment was not exactly a customer service warning email. Ale was controlled too. There were officials called ale tasters, or ale conners, whose job was to inspect beer. Yes, medieval England had professional beer inspectors. While everyone else was dying from infections, some guy's official job was to walk around town like, I'm sorry, I must drink this beer for the safety of the kingdom. They checked if the ale was watered down, badly brewed, or being sold unfairly. If it failed, the brewer could be fined or punished. Number 8. The ordeal of hot iron. This might be one of the worst ideas in legal history. If you were accused of a crime and there was not enough evidence, they did not say, maybe we need better investigation. No. They said, let's make God decide. And how did God decide? By making you hold a red-hot piece of iron. Because apparently, divine justice needed a blacksmith. The accused person had to carry a glowing iron bar for a few steps. Then their hands were wrapped in bandages. 3 days later, officials unwrapped it and inspected the wound. If the wound was healing cleanly, you were innocent. If it was infected, swollen, or disgusting, you were guilty. The idea was that God would protect the innocent person from serious harm. So if your wound healed well, it meant heaven had basically signed your legal defense. But if your hand got infected, which was very possible in a world where people thought bathing too much was suspicious, then congratulations, you were now both injured and guilty. The church eventually pulled away from these ordeals after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Priests were told to stop participating because the whole thing looked like humans trying to force God into court. And honestly, that was a fair decision. Number 7. The ordeal of cold water. If hot iron sounds insane, cold water basically said, hold my bucket. This was another trial by ordeal. Same basic idea. If humans could not figure out if you were guilty, they would throw you into water and let God handle the investigation. The accused person was tied up and lowered or thrown into a pond, river, or pool. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. Yes, you could be convicted because your body understood buoyancy. The logic was that water was pure, so if you were guilty, the water would reject you and push you back up. If you were innocent, the water would accept you. Which sounds poetic until you realize that being accepted by water is just drowning with better branding. Now, they usually tied a rope around the person so they could pull them back out. But this was medieval Europe. Ropes slipped, people panicked, rivers had currents. And nobody had a rescue team standing by with a whistle and a flotation device, so your best-case scenario was sinking long enough to prove innocence without dying. Your worst-case scenario was floating and being declared guilty because your lungs refused to quit. Number 6. The fashion police. Medieval people did not just care about what you wore, they cared about whether you had the social permission to wear it. These were called sumptuary laws, and they were basically a government dress code designed to keep everyone visually trapped in their social class. If you were a peasant, you were not supposed to dress like a noble. If you were a merchant, you could be wealthy, but that did not mean you could just start walking around covered in silk and fur like you owned a castle and 3 unnecessary hunting dogs. Certain fabrics, colors, trims, and furs were restricted by rank or income. Purple, scarlet, velvet, fine fur, and fancy imported cloth were not just fashion choices. They were status signals, and the people at the top wanted those signals protected. Because if a rich merchant could dress like a noble, then how would strangers instantly know who deserved extra respect and who deserved to be ignored near a puddle? That was the fear. Medieval society was built on visible hierarchy. Your clothes were basically your LinkedIn profile, tax bracket, family tree, and dating app bio all at once. Number 5. The ban on football. In 1314, King Edward II banned football in London. And no, this was not polite modern football with shin guards, referees, and someone pretending to be injured for strategic reasons. Medieval football was basically a neighborhood riot with a ball somewhere inside it. The ball might be an inflated pig's bladder. The teams could be entire villages. The rules were mostly suggestions. People kicked, shoved, crashed into each other, ran through streets, damaged property, and generally turned exercise into a public safety incident. So when London complained about noise and disorder, the king banned it. Playing football could get you imprisoned. Later rulers also hated football because they wanted men practicing archery instead. England needed archers for war, and football was seen as a useless distraction from national defense. And the funniest thing is, the bans did not really kill football. People kept playing because humans have always had one powerful instinct. If you tell them not to chase a ball, they will immediately organize a tournament. Number 4. The Royal Fish Law. This one sounds pretty fake, but it is actually real. In medieval England, certain large sea creatures became known as royal fish. Whales and sturgeon were treated as special creatures that belonged to the monarch when taken or found in certain circumstances. So if a giant whale washed up on shore, it was not just a dead whale, it was a dead whale with government paperwork. You could not simply stroll down to the beach and say, "Nice, free whale." No, that whale had a boss. The crown had a claim over it. Why? Because whales and sturgeon were seen as rare, valuable, majestic, and important enough to belong to royalty. Normal people got regular fish. The king got the dramatic fish. The law is still remembered today because the royal fish idea technically survived into modern British legal tradition. In practice, nobody is waiting at the beach with a crown-shaped shopping cart. But the historical rule is still wonderfully absurd. Number 3. The right of the first night. This is the rule everyone thinks they know. A medieval lord supposedly had the legal right to sleep with a bride on her wedding night before her husband did. It is called droit du seigneur, or jus primae noctis, and movies have used it for years to make medieval lords look like absolute monsters. There is just one problem. Historians have found little to no solid evidence that this ever existed as a real legal right in medieval Europe. The most famous medieval rule might be medieval fan fiction. That does not mean medieval peasants had a nice time. They absolutely did not. Lords had power. Serfs had limited freedom. Marriage could involve payments, permissions, taxes, and local control. There was a real thing called merchet, where a serf might have to pay a lord for permission to marry, which is still ridiculous. Imagine needing your landlord's permission to get married. But that is very different from the lord legally claiming the bride's wedding night. The first night story probably became popular later because it made the Middle Ages look more barbaric, more dramatic, and more useful for political propaganda. Number 2. The Templar dinner rules. The Knights Templar were warrior monks, which already sounds like two jobs that should not be in the same sentence. They were supposed to fight like soldiers, pray like monks, and live under strict religious rules, so naturally, even dinner had regulations. According to the Templar rule, meat was limited. It was generally allowed only a few times a week because eating too much flesh was believed to corrupt the body. On Fridays, they observed fasting rules and avoided animal products like eggs and milk. Their diet was not just about health, it was about discipline, obedience, religious purity, and making sure these armed men did not start living like party animals with swords. They even ate in silence and were expected to control themselves at the table. Which is hilarious, because these were men who could charge into battle, but the organization still worried that a second serving of meat might spiritually corrupt them. Medieval life was strange because the same society that sent knights into brutal warfare also looked at eggs on the wrong day and said, absolutely not. That is dangerous. Number 1. The Suspicious Salmon Law. This one is not medieval, but it deserves to be here because it sounds like something a medieval clerk wrote after drinking questionable ale. In the UK, the Salmon Act 1986 made it an offense to handle salmon in suspicious circumstances. That is the phrase, suspicious circumstances, which immediately raises the obvious question, what does suspicious salmon handling look like? Are you holding it behind your back? Are you whispering to it in a dark alley? Did the salmon arrive wearing a tiny disguise? The law was not actually written to punish people for looking weird near fish. It was meant to fight illegal fishing and the trade of unlawfully caught salmon. In real legal terms, it was about people receiving, keeping, moving, or disposing of salmon when they knew, or should have reasonably suspected, that it came from an illegal source. That makes sense. But the wording is so funny that it became one of Britain's most famous weird laws, because handling salmon in suspicious circumstances sounds less like a criminal offense and more like a detective show where the victim is a fish. That is all for today. Subscribe to see our future videos. Mr. Redhead.